Okay, so get this, listeners. You wanted us to unpack some of history's most notorious leaders, and wow, did you deliver. This list you sent us, top 10 worst world leaders, it's like a live wire,
Yeah,
constantly shifting.
it really is.
Based on user comments? I mean, how wild is that? We're diving into a sea of opinions here
Yeah.
about dictators, revolutionaries, politicians from all over the globe.
Yeah.
It even begs the question, are evil and bad leadership actually the same thing?
It's fascinating, isn't it? This whole idea of a definitive worst of list, this dynamic list, it throws a wrench in that.
Right.
It makes you realize that what makes a leader the worst, well, it can be so subjective.
Oh, really?
Is it just a numbers game, based on cabinets?
Hmm.
Or is it about like a collapsing economy? Or
Okay.
what about the less obvious but equally devastating stuff like destroying a culture, silencing opposition? We're going to see all these different perspectives in the comments as we dig in.
Okay, so let's start with the names that are practically synonymous with bad leadership. Hitler, Stalin, Kim Jong-un, Pol Pot. These guys consistently top the charts, right? We all know the basic stories of their reigns of terror, but what I find so interesting is how the comments go beyond the surface.
I agree.
It's not just a chorus of Hitler was bad, it's deeper.
You're right. Like, take Stalin, for example.
Okay.
There's this one comment that highlights how effective he was as an administrator,
Really?
alongside his brutality, which we can't deny.
Yeah.
It's unsettling, isn't it? That duality, that
Yeah.
a leader can be both a brilliant strategist and a monstrous tyrant at the same time.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around.
It really makes you think, how do we even begin to reconcile those two sides of a historical figure? And
Yeah.
what does that say about power itself?
Wait, that comment about Stalin being effective? It's almost more disturbing than just focusing on his cruelty.
Right.
It implies that being good at his job enabled him to do those awful things on such a massive scale.
Exactly. It challenges the simple idea that bad leaders are just incompetent or stupid.
Right.
In Stalin's case, his administrative skills, his ability to organize, to get things done, they became tools for repression, for violence.
Wow.
And it raises a really important question. Can competence, if it's not guided by morals, actually become a dangerous thing in a leader?
It's a scary thought.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then there are the comments by Kim Jong-il's funeral.
Mm.
Some people actually found humor in his death,
Wow.
like a sense of relief almost,
Really?
which clashes so much with the official narrative of mourning that North Korea was pushing.
Of course, yeah.
It's a stark reminder that what the public thinks can be totally different from the image a regime wants to project.
It's a great example of how even in the most oppressive societies, even where things are tightly controlled, whispers of dissent, individual experiences, they still exist.
They find a way.
Those comments, those seemingly offhand remarks about Kim Jong-il's funeral, they reveal something deeper about power.
Yeah.
It's never absolute. There's always this undercurrent of individual thought, emotion, that even the strongest propaganda can't completely crush.
Okay, we've talked about the top tier,
Yeah.
the big names.
Yeah.
But now let's move beyond the global infamy and look at some figures who might not be as well known, but are still controversial.
Right.
We've got Saddam Hussein, for instance.
Okay.
One commenter focused on the fact that his name actually translates to the destroyer.
Oh, wow.
And they found that chillingly appropriate given his brutal reign.
Yeah, I can see that.
Almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, you know?
It is tempting to read into those kinds of coincidences, especially with someone like Saddam Hussein. But while I wouldn't put too much stock in just names and symbolism, it does make you think about how certain leaders, maybe intentionally, maybe not, cultivate an image, and that image becomes tied to their actions.
Right.
With Saddam, that image was definitely one of ruthlessness, of aggression.
And then there are the comments about Idi Amin being worse than Hitler
Oh, wow.
because of the seeming randomness and brutality of the violence under his regime. That's a big claim. And I think it needs a deeper look into the historical context to understand the comparison, or if you can even compare them at all.
Absolutely. When we're talking about people who committed atrocities, it's easy to want to rank them on a scale of evil.
Right.
But those comparisons, while tempting, can be too simplistic, even misleading. We have to remember that every historical situation is different. There are unique circumstances, political factors, social factors. Reducing complex events to a who's worse contest doesn't do justice to the horrors of each situation.
So true. Things get interesting when we look at the Thai leaders on the list.
Yeah, okay.
Saxon and Yingluck Shinawatra, along with Somchai Wongsawat. What really jumped out at me was how many comments were filled with accusations of, corruption and self-enrichment,
Right.
which shows how perceptions of leadership can be so deeply tied to local context and what people have gone through.
That's so important to remember. And it raises the question, are those perceptions accurate? Or are they being shaped by the political climate, by biases within Thailand? We have to remember the source material, while it gives us a glimpse of public opinion, it doesn't really dig into the evidence behind those accusations.
That's true.
It's a good reminder that online comments aren't necessarily facts. We have to consider all sides, all viewpoints, and how complex the situation really is.
One comment about Yingluck Shinawatra mentioned how much she traveled during her time in office. Some people saw it as frivolous, others argued it's normal diplomatic stuff.
Yeah.
This sparked a whole debate about the optics of leadership, how even little actions can affect public perception.
It's an interesting observation. It makes you compare someone like Yingluck Shinawatra, who is very visible on the world stage, to someone like Kim Jong-un, who we know is super reclusive. Does that isolation make people distrustful? Or does it make him seem more powerful, more mysterious? There's no easy answer. And it shows how different styles of leadership can be seen in such different ways.
Yeah, it's fascinating how those different approaches can play out. Yingluck Shinawatra being so visible, it sparked debate, scrutiny. Kim Jong-un being secluded, it maybe creates more of an enigma. It shows how even choosing to engage with the world or withdraw can be a tool for a leader to shape their image.
Exactly. It highlights this tension between transparency and control in leadership. Leaders who are always in the public eye, they face more scrutiny. Their every move is analyzed.
Right.
On the other hand, those who keep their distance, they might seem more powerful, more mysterious, but they also risk appearing out of touch. There's no one right way to do it. And how effective each style is depends on a lot of things. Cultural norms, the political situation, even the personality of the leader.
Okay, so as we go down this list, it feels like we're moving into murkier and murkier water.
Yeah.
This section labeled newcomers and contenders, this is where the opinions really start flying.
Oh, really?
But there's less of a clear historical consensus. We're talking about figures like Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, Hibatullah Akhundzada, the leader of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and, of course, Vladimir Putin. It's here that it becomes really clear how hard it is to judge leadership in real time.
Like trying to write a review of a book when you've only read the first few chapters.
Yeah.
You have some idea of the characters, the plot, but the whole story hasn't played out yet. How do we assess what leaders do when we don't know the final impact of their decisions?
That's a great way to put it. It's like, do we go with public opinion, which can change so quickly? Or do we try to take a longer view, which might take years, even decades, to form?
And that's where critical thinking becomes so crucial. We need to be aware of our own biases,
Of course.
of how the media portrays things. And we have to remember that we can only judge based on the information we have right now.
Right.
It reminds us that history is always being reassessed as new information comes out and perspectives change.
Okay, so speaking of figures who spark a lot of debate, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, George W. Bush,
Right.
and the very divided opinions about his presidency.
This entry really shows how political ideology shapes how we see history. You see comments praising his leadership after 9/11, but others strongly condemn his decision to invade Iraq and everything that happened after.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder that even within one country, interpretations of the same events and the leaders involved can be totally different. What one person sees as a necessary war, another sees as a reckless act of aggression. There's no middle ground.
It makes you realize that even when we're talking about relatively recent history, there's no one objective truth.
No.
What people think is shaped by their own experiences, beliefs, values.
Right.
It makes judging leadership even harder because we have to acknowledge that subjectivity.
Exactly. It brings us back to that basic question we started with. What makes a leader bad?
Yeah.
Is it only about the results of what they do? Or do intentions and the circumstances matter? And can we ever really separate those things when we're judging leaders?
This list makes us face the fact that there's no easy answer. And including George W. Bush, a figure whose legacy is still being debated so fiercely, really drives that point home.
Yeah.
It highlights the challenges of judging leadership when emotions are still raw and perspectives are so divided. It's a reminder that history is an ongoing conversation.
It is. And that conversation is richer because of the different voices and viewpoints. Even though this list is based on user comments, which can be subjective and emotional, it exposes us to perspectives we might not otherwise see.
Right.
It forces us to engage with those different interpretations, to really grapple with what leadership is all about.
It's like this list is a mirror, reflecting not just the actions of these leaders, but our own perceptions and judgments.
Absolutely.
It challenges us to look at our own biases and consider the many sides of leadership.
It's not about simply labeling leaders as good or bad. It's about understanding what contributes to their successes, their failures.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the impact of their choices and acknowledging how complex history is.
Okay, so we've covered a lot, from the infamous dictators to the more recent and maybe more controversial figures. But this list goes even deeper. It includes figures like Vlad Tepes, the inspiration for Dracula,
Oh, wow.
whose reputation for brutality, especially his impalement methods, is legendary.
Yeah.
And then there's Leopold II, Belgium, whose colonization of the Congo Free State was just horrific.
Yeah.
Exploitation, violence.
Right.
It's a stark reminder the cruelty and tyranny aren't limited to any one time period or ideology.
You're absolutely right. These figures, while separated by time and geography, show how power, when it's unchecked and driven by greed or a lust for control, can lead to horrible things.
Yeah.
It reminds us that the capacity for cruelty is part of human nature, and it's something we need to be constantly on guard against.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one.
It is.
This list, with its range of figures and the different opinions it brings up, forces us to confront the darkest parts of leadership and the enduring human capacity for both good and evil.
I agree. It's a lot to think about.
It is. It's crazy to think about, millions suffered and died under Leopold's rule, all for his own wealth, his own power.
Yeah.
There's this comment I read which just called him a glorified slave owner. And honestly, when you look at the history, it's not that far off.
What's really disturbing is that even with all the evidence of his crimes, Leopold managed to keep up this image of respectability for years.
Right?
It shows how powerful propaganda can be and how people in power can twist the narrative to benefit themselves.
Wait, hold on. How could someone do such horrible things on such a massive scale and still be seen as respectable? I mean, the Congo. Were people just not aware of what was going on?
That's the question, isn't it? Remember, back then, information traveled much slower, and access to it was often controlled by the people in charge. Leopold was a master of public relations. He knew how to work the system. He built relationships with influential people, gave money to charities, presented himself as this kind, generous philanthropist. He used his wealth and connections to hide the truth about what was happening in his colony.
So he basically used his wealth and power to avoid being held accountable.
Exactly.
That's so messed up. It makes you realize that power isn't just about force. It's about controlling the story, shaping how people see things.
Precisely. And that's not just something from the past. We see it today, too, in different ways. The ability to control information, to shape the narrative, it's a huge form of power.
This is a scary reminder that even the worst things can be hidden, justified even, when the people in charge have the means to do it. It makes you think about how important independent media is and having access to reliable information so we can challenge those narratives.
Absolutely. A free press, access to information we can trust, those are crucial for holding those in power accountable and preventing the kind of abuses that happened under Leopold.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little. There's another leader on this list who sparked a lot of discussion. Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. His rule was all about corruption, violence, economic ruin.
Yeah.
One comment that really hit me said that he flaunted his wealth while his people suffered. It's a sentiment you hear a lot from those who lived under his rule.
Mugabe's rule is a perfect example of how disconnected leaders can become from the people they're supposed to represent. When leaders put their own gain ahead of the well-being of their citizens, it always leads to resentment, instability, and a breakdown of trust.
It's a pattern we see over and over again in history, right?
It is.
A king hoarding treasure while his people starve. A dictator living in luxury while everyone else suffers in poverty. Abusing power for personal gain? It seems to be a common thread in how many leaders fall from grace.
You're right. The pursuit of power can become the only goal, completely separated from any sense of responsibility or serving the people. And when that happens, when leaders forget about the common good, it creates the perfect conditions for corruption, instability, and ultimately their own downfall.
Okay, so we've talked about some historical figures, but this list also includes leaders who are still alive, still in power.
Right.
The fact that people like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are on there has, of course, led to some pretty heated debate.
That's not surprising, and it's important to remember these are complicated situations with global implications. It's not just about personalities, but about understanding how power works on a global scale.
Right. I mean, the comments about Putin, they range from calling him a power-hungry tyrant to straight up labeling him a killer. a mass murderer, especially with the war in Ukraine.
Those are very serious accusations, ones that need to be carefully considered. We can't just brush them aside. The suffering in Ukraine is undeniable, and someone needs to be held accountable.
Of course.
But while we acknowledge how serious the situation is, we also need to be careful about making final judgments about leaders while things are still happening.
It's easy to jump to conclusions based on what we see on the news,
Right.
but history often shows us things that weren't obvious in the moment, complexities, nuances.
Exactly. We need to approach these situations with a balance of judgment, informed by what we know, and an awareness that our current perspective might be limited. It's about recognizing potential biases and trying to get a more complete understanding of all the factors involved.
And when it comes to Xi Jinping, the comments focus a lot on how he consolidated power in China. The crackdown on dissent, the persecution of ethnic minorities. Some even compare him to Kim Jong-un, saying China is becoming like a North Korea light edition.
That's a pretty strong comparison, and it reflects a lot of the anxiety in the West about China's growing global influence. But it's important to remember that China is not North Korea. It's a huge, diverse country with a long history and a political system that's unique. We can't just put it in a simple category or stereotype it.
It reminds us that we need to be careful about judging other countries and their leaders based on our own beliefs and systems. Reducing complex realities to simple labels can be misleading and prevent us from understanding the nuances.
I think that's a key point. It's easy to fall into the trap of looking at other cultures and their leaders through our own preconceived notions. But to truly understand what's going on, we need to approach these situations with nuance, an open mind, and a willingness to engage with perspectives that might challenge our own assumptions.
Okay, so it sounds like what we're learning here is that evaluating leadership, especially when it comes to people like Putin and Xi Jinping, requires a delicate balance.
It does.
It's about recognizing the potential for abuses of power, acknowledging the suffering caused by their actions, but also not oversimplifying complex geopolitical situations.
It's about making informed judgments, being aware of our own limitations, and striving for a deeper understanding of all the factors involved. It's a challenging but necessary approach when dealing with leaders who are still shaping history.
This whole discussion has really made me see how important it is to be informed and critical about the information we consume, especially now when narratives can be so easily manipulated and we're constantly bombarded with information.
It's more important than ever to think critically, be aware of our biases, and seek out different viewpoints. We can't just accept everything we hear at face value, especially when it comes to evaluating leadership and how it impacts the world.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But even remembering the past doesn't mean we'll make better choices now, does it?
That's the real challenge. We can study these leaders, analyze their decisions, and try to understand what led them down certain paths. But ultimately, it's up to us to apply those lessons to the challenges we face today.
So we've explored this fascinating and sometimes disturbing list of worst world leaders. We've debated the criteria, thought about the ethics of judging historical figures, and even ventured into the murky territory of evaluating leaders who are still in power. What does it all mean? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think it shows that leadership is a complex thing with no easy answers. There's no magic formula for success, no guaranteed way to avoid the traps of power. It's a delicate balancing act, influenced by context, circumstances, individual choices, and even luck.
It also means that we, the people, have a responsibility to be informed, engaged, and critical of those in power. We can't just sit back and watch.
Right.
The choices our leaders make have real consequences, and we have a duty to hold them accountable.
That's what democracy is all about, isn't it? The power ultimately lies with the people. We have the right and the responsibility to demand better from our leaders, to question their decisions, and to work toward a fairer and more just world.
So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We spend a lot of time looking at the worst of leadership. But what about the best?
Yeah.
What makes those leaders who leave behind a positive impact? What can we learn from their successes and the mistakes of those who failed? Those are questions I encourage you to explore on your own.
Because ultimately, studying leadership in all its forms isn't just about judging. It's about understanding how power works, the complexities of human nature, and the ongoing effort to create a better future.
Man, it's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It has.
From dictators to revolutionaries, from historical figures to those still shaping the world today, we've explored a whole spectrum of what people consider worst leaders.
And what's really interesting is how this whole exploration has gone beyond those simple labels of good and bad.
Yeah, it has.
We've seen how people view leadership. It's shaped by so many things, the context, the culture, personal experiences. And we've really had to think hard about how to judge leaders whose actions, well, they've had a huge impact, both good and bad.
It's made me realize there's no easy way to judge leadership. It's not just about the outcomes, it's also about what they intended, the circumstances they were in, and how events just play out, sometimes unpredictably.
You're right. We've also seen how power, even when someone starts with good intentions, can be corrupting.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. It reminds us that anyone who seeks power, anyone who has it, needs to be kept in check. There need to be systems of accountability, transparency, and we need citizens who are informed and engaged, constantly watching.
This whole conversation has honestly left me with more questions than answers. But I think that's a good thing, actually. It's sparked this curiosity in me to learn more, not just about specific leaders, but about power itself,
Yeah.
the systems that shape leadership, the choices we make as individuals when we're faced with those in authority.
I think that's the best outcome of any deep dive into history, really.
I think so, too.
To come away from it wanting to learn more, question what you thought you knew, and engage with the world in a more critical way.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into this list, this thought-provoking and sometimes unsettling list of worst world leaders, I want to leave you with one last thing to think about.
Okay.
We've spent a lot of time on the negative, the failures of leadership. But what about the other side? The leaders who inspire, who lift people up, who leave behind a positive change.
Right.
What makes them tick? What lessons can we learn from their successes and from the mistakes of those who failed? These are questions I really encourage you to think about, explore on your own.
I think that's a great challenge, to look at those examples of positive leadership, those individuals who, even with all the challenges and temptations of power, managed to make the world better. Study their lives, their choices, their motivations, what set them apart, what can we learn from them? Because at the end of the day, understanding leadership with all its complexities and contradictions, it's not about pointing fingers or judging, it's about recognizing that potential for both good and evil that's within us all.
Yeah.
And it's about working towards a world where the best of humanity can shine through.
It's about realizing that we all have a part to play in shaping the kind of leadership we want to see, whether it's in our families, our communities, or on a global scale. It's about demanding accountability, pushing for transparency, and standing up for the values that will lead us to a more just and equal future for everyone.
I agree.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's made you curious, challenged your assumptions, and reminded you how important it is to be informed and engaged citizens.
Yes, thank you for listening.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep working towards a better world.